Okay. Patricia Watwood, who's been on the podcast before, episode 105, you're looking for it. She has written a book. It's called The Path of Drawing, Lessons for Everyday Creativity and Mindfulness. So, hi, Patty. I'll call you Patty. How did this all come about?
Hey, good. Hello. It's morning here, so I'm still drinking coffee. Good morning, John. Um, this came about because I was approached by the publisher Monticelli Studio Press, which creates a number of high quality art instructional books. They're the publishers of Juliet Aristides books and Rob Zeller's Figurative Artist Handbook, Mario Robinson's watercolor book. So I'd been aware of their books through some of my colleagues, and they were seeking an author to do a drawing book. But it took me a while to come up with an idea about what I wanted to do because I felt like, especially Juliet has done such excellent work doing these like atelier kind of classical drawing. And I felt I wanted to do something different. And I think I, over time, realized that the thing I was most interested in was talking about how drawing for me is really almost a spiritual practice or a practice of mindfulness that I use like other practices like yoga or like walking meditation as a way to get quiet. And that I've also really come to understand that that the practice of drawing, that when I started to learn to draw, you know, that process really changed me a lot over time. That I didn't start out being the artist or the person that I am before I learned to draw, but the process of drawing and learning to draw became this space in which all of these other things developed. So then once I realized that that seemed important to me and something I wanted to share, then fortunately, the publisher was really supportive, talking about not just a book on how to draw, but a book about why to draw.
Wow. That's very ambitious. I'm amazed you're able to get all that into a book. How did you structure it? Like, how did you? If I can just putting my self in your place and go, God, how would you do that?
Well, it's funny that you say that because I really did have 9 or 10 panic attacks at the beginning of this project because the idea of even writing a book on drawing, right? This great form. There have been so many amazing books on drawing, and you're like, what do I possibly have to say about a book on drawing? This thing that I like,
Yeah,
it just felt
just
like
just when you
really.
thought you had a handle on imposter syndrome, this idea
Yeah,
came up.
exactly. Right. Like, so that was really challenging. And there were, so there, but there were a couple structural things that helped me just kind of put one foot in front of the other. The prompt was very much to do an instructional book that had projects, right? That wasn't, of course, the irony, if you want to write a book on drawing and you want people to draw, they can't just read a book on drawing. you
Yeah.
you have to read the book and then you have to set the book down and then you have to draw. So I created a bunch of discrete projects that can be used. I think the book is actually good for teachers because it has all like 12 different projects that are 30 to 45 minute to hour long lesson projects that could be, extracted, and using those as a way to really develop the practice and talk about skills and talk about some skills. And from a pretty broad approach, I wanted the book to be broadly appealing to people who really maybe hadn't picked up a pencil before, as opposed to more developed artists who are then trying to figure out how to cultivate their voice. So kind of those two different audience numbers. So focusing on the lessons, then you can talk about the concepts of value or contour line, um, details of technical expertise. But then all throughout was woven the themes of why to continue with a habit of drawing. Because I think that was my goal, is that trying to get people to inspire to make drawing and or just creative practice. It might be watercolor. It might not be strictly like drawing with a pencil, but to make it a regular practice. And there are a lot of reasons why we say we want to do a habit, a practice, but then we don't, right? Something else gets in the way, something else seems more important. There's also just internal barriers like procrastination or, frankly, self doubt that start to creep in and impede our just beginning. And so I really wanted to also just confront, talk about those things, that those are really normal for me, even though I've been working for 20 years. And so if you want to have this practice, how can you learn more about what's really common with these kinds of struggles? Um, Maybe setting a timer, rituals of beginning, teaching rituals of beginning, or teaching ideas about setting an intention. What are all the different things that can strengthen your intention towards a practice? Understanding the reality that we often say we want to do something, but then actually making it happen can be challenging.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I see this a lot with people who want to learn meditation. It's like, yeah, the first week is great, and then it's like then they're into trouble. Were you able to get over the problem that a lot of people drawing have, or address it anyway, of focusing on the pleasure of drawing? Because a lot of people, when they're drawing, they're kind of judging their drawing, and it becomes about, I didn't make a very good drawing, or I can't get that, doesn't look like what I'm looking at, I'm terrible. And it's like that becomes an unpleasant experience, and I don't want to draw anymore because I don't like the way that makes me feel.
That is absolutely, I mean, that's really kind of the key, like, idea of why do we stop drawing? So there's a number of things. For one thing, I talk about, frankly, just a principle of non-judgment, right? That can you bring into your practice, to the work that you're doing, instead of constantly being evaluative, right, it's wrong, the values are too dark, they're too light, right? Can you actually try to cultivate an attitude of open-mindedness in terms of, like, it is not my job to judge this right now. It is just my task to do this thing, to be present in this space. Later, if you're trying to develop a sketch that you might turn into a painting, there might be a time later that you kind of want to invite the editor into the room and, like, think about something more critically. But I think it's really important at all times, actually, in any creative practice, whether you're in the middle of painting, watercolor, drawing, that in the middle of that time, that you cultivate more a spirit of non-judgment. It's not my job to judge what I'm doing at this time, because it can be very crippling, right? Because, so the other, I do talk a lot about that. I have to, and I came to be, I I really was struggling, feeling like I wasn't thriving in my work. And frankly, in just my personal life as well, going through my 40s, some midlife crisis, like, just a lot of complex things were making it really challenging for me emotionally. And and I realized I wasn't thriving. So then I had to kind of go learn about what all those things were. Books like Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way, she talks about how procrastination or anxiety, fear, how they really are provoked during the creative act, and or there's, like, the censor is what she calls it, right? This negative voice. So I really had to come to understand that I have this really negative voice in my head. He's really an asshole, and he's not helping me get this work done. But I've also come to understand that pretty much that's universal, and that I can think of that part of myself not necessarily as something that needs to be banished, but something that just needs to be sort of accepted with compassion, like, oh, hello, Thank you for your input. Now, please sit down quietly over there and don't talk while I work on this project. That the fear inside us is part of our self trying to keep us safe, trying to protect us from harm. It doesn't want us to get hurt, right? And so, even just having a little compassion for why I have that voice. So I talk about that a lot, and I think that the main reason that people don't, master drawing or develop a creative practice, it has nothing to do with the fact that they can't hatch or they can't figure out how to get the proportions right. It has to do with the emotional barriers to like, I don't have time, which is really actually, I am not worth the time. This is not important enough for me to make time for it. Or feelings of self-doubt, fear, anxiety. Those are the reasons people don't continue making art. It's not because you don't hatch well enough, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's brilliant.
yeah. So the whole book is kind of about how, whenever we draw, ideally, we want to get into the flow, right? That's what we're hoping for, is to kind of get into this beautiful creative space where things feel really light and you feel like everything's just flowing. Often, unfortunately, all of these negative voices arise, right?
Yeah,
And so the book is kind of focused on how do you, whenever you're stepping into that process, how do you just be mindful that, okay, this is the emotional clatter that's happening in my mind while I'm doing this. This is normal. And how do you keep going?
yeah. Yeah, it sounds like you are gently shepherding people away from outcome focused to process focused.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Absolutely, and particularly in this the way that I've structured these projects. And this came out of for myself, I had a very rigorous atelier training, and frankly, it's a very judgmental space. Learning a classical discipline, you either got the proportions right or you got them wrong. There's a lot of rigor and a lot of evaluation. But if you take that all the way forward into your creative life, it becomes crippling, right? All that discipline that you started with that helped you attain the skills then becomes very restrictive. Um, and so I started as as a practice kind of outside the kind of work of the studio, right? If you become a professional artist, then art actually becomes your job. And it often loses that like lighthearted play, exploration, freedom that you started with, which is what you got into it. So I started using a mixed media sketchbook that's small in size. It's like 8 by 8 inches, or sometimes even I have little ones that are like 6 by 6 inches, and have a practice of doing little projects in there that often only take like 20 or 30 minutes. And I often do them maybe at the very beginning of the day, or sometimes actually very much at the end of the day, kind of in the evening when I'm tired. And I feel like sometimes when I'm a little tired, my unconscious mind has a little bit easier access to what I'm doing. And so using this small scale sketchbook, it really then is much more about play, process, exploration, a private space. It's not about showing people what I'm doing, right? Like it's not outcome oriented at all. I'm often trying to get myself to maybe draw from imagination or paint from imagination, which frankly is like kind of terrifying somehow. Like I'm constantly like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. Right. And so, and I, it makes me feel vulnerable to feel like I'm being observed in that time. So to have a kind of do it on a really small scale, do it kind of a short period of time, then it creates this space where I can kind of safely play around and explore that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, when you were talking about your atelier training, it seems to me that the return to the craft and the skills, which is kind of what ateliers are all about learning,
Mm-hmm.
old master techniques, old master skills. That's beautiful. but it seems like they have um, adopted old master teaching methods as well, which is unfortunate because the we've advanced hugely in our understanding of how people learn and how people gain
Oh,
skill, and it's a real shame that those advances haven't been brought to those skills, if you know what I mean.
I think that's a really fascinating insight. And I think that in the ateliers, um, it very much is a tradition that for it wasn't ever really broken. There were always teachers, I can kind of trace my lineage from, my teacher, Ted Seth Jacobs, who studied with Frank Vincent Dumont, who was a student at the Académie Julienne, right, who goes all the way back to the French Academy. So the very much the teaching pedagogy, it's it's a you're right, it's a kind of conservative lineage going through. And in one ways that's amazing. It's amazing that you can kind of, then this teacher studied with this person and this, and that, studied with Rubens. It's amazing to see that, the lineage of those connections, that we are kind of like a long family, like interconnected web of artists working in this tradition. But I think that the ateliers, especially since in terms of subject matter, um, even style of art, has become so open in the 21st century that
Yeah.
the ateliers tend to sort of just work on the skill set, and they don't tend to cultivate the conceptual, the picture making, the idea making side of the artist. And that's interesting. I want, you teach and have a lot more connection with like 21st century pedagogical approaches. Like, can you? Um, I think you're right, but I haven't really thought through that in terms of what might that mean for an art education.
Well, I had it really strongly with craniosacral therapy, right? So I learned craniosacral therapy with the College of Craniosacral Therapy in London. Had a very particular way of teaching, and then I was living in Australia, and I founded the Australian Institute of Craniosacral Therapy, and I had to go through this government accreditation process, and it was very stringent. And they put it under vocational training, which would be like, trades, carpenters,
Mm-hmm.
plumbers, that kind of thing. And they had a particular system, and that was like a real wake up call for me in terms of that the way of teaching had moved on. And I, worked with training consultants about it as I was kind of shepherding the course through this process. And I realized like I was being draconian for no reason other than that's the way I learned. And they're like,
Right.
like for simple things like you'd have an exam and I'd say, okay, well, I just have exams. Well, what do you, do the students know what they're going to be examined on? It's like, no, they're just supposed to know everything. And he's like, you can't do that. Like, well, why not? That's the way I learned. It's like, no, you have to like let them know what's expected of them, what they're going to, be examined on in this particular thing, and then, just do that kind of thing, and then build on that kind of thing. And it was just like one after another after another. And when I think back on the way I learned, it seems medieval in comparison, and so much more difficult than it needed to be.
That's so
You know.
interesting. I think you've really hit on something, that a concept that I've never really thought on. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about pedagogy per se, but I think that's key. Like, I was just hearing somebody say, people say, well, that's the way I did it and I turned out okay, right?
Yeah.
And usually if they're saying that, they probably didn't, right? They're maybe kind of perpetuating the same sort of abusive trauma that they did survive, and they did maybe like get through, but maybe it didn't actually help them. Um, I guess I'm thinking, how are we thinking differently now, or what are we? Um, how are our ideas about the mind changing? And I'm going to kind of, this maybe is a non sequitur, but going back to the themes of the book, Over and over again, I'm very interested in artists and creative people of all types talking about where ideas come from and where inspiration comes from. And I think in the 20th century, highly individualist, society, at a certain point, the ideas came from within, they come from your mind. But a much older idea is that the ideas are like the muses come and whisper to you, right? And give
Mm-hmm.
you the idea. Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a wonderful book about creativity called Big Magic. And her
Mm.
idea is that ideas are just like zipping, they're kind of this astral plane, and they're like zipping around the universe trying to find a human collaborator. Right.
Mm.
And if they come to John and they're like, John, I've got this great story. I need you to tell this story. And you're like, yeah, actually, I'm kind of really busy with this other project and that doesn't fit. And then it zips around and it finds me. And then I'm like, I get the idea and I pursue it. And I keep feeling Rick Rubin just wrote a good book, and he expresses the same idea that artists actually, what they do is they put up, they're finally attuned, like sensitive machines that like put up their antenna into the universe to try to sort of receive these ideas.
Yeah.
um, and that, I don't know, I think that thinking about what, how do our ideas about inspiration or thought or human connectivity, how do they change, that just seems to be something that is very emergent, that, or inescapable, like it's always been the idea about where ideas come from. And it is expressing itself in a new and a different way in the 21st century than it did in the 16th century.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like your approach with your book, which is more of a contemplative, mindful, meaning self reflective as you're going through the process kind of approach, that more than most things, I think, creates a kind of quiet inside where you may be able to hear those inspiring things more than other approaches.
Yeah. That's why people always advocate for meditation as a practice, right? That by having that component in your life, it builds calm and it creates space in your mind and in your presence for your higher self or ideas from the universe to settle in, for you to get quiet enough to hear them.
Yeah.
And hopefully also to give you a sense of kind of calm and presence, contentment in your own internal space, that you're able to then kind of interact with the world, interact with those ideas with a lot of equanimity. Um, I think that seated meditation is a great practice, and I actually like seated meditation a lot. But my insight in creating this book is that for visual artists and for a certain kind of person, actually seated, being seated cross-legged, um, sitting quietly for 20 minutes sounds more like torture than meditation. But if you give that same person a pencil, maybe some colored gel pens, maybe a couple watercolor, and that once you get your hand engaged and your hand is sort of moving and connected with your eye and connected with the mind, it creates a really beneficial feedback loop of, of flow. And I think that that can enable us to get into that same meditative state. In Zen meditation, that's, art practice is literally like a meditation practice. There's also walking practice. So, I think my understanding is that humans are are different kinds of people. Artists are often, we have a lot in common. And so I think that accessing that meditative space is something that you can actually do through drawing and doing through a creative practice, perhaps even more easily, more naturally than through seated meditation. And of course, it's also nonverbal, right? That the visual, creative, visual imagination, that images, that they can be completely nonverbal and very much pictorial. It you may have this. I'd be curious to see what you say, but I find that when I've done seated meditation, that often when it's most feels like it's working the best is when I actually have a lot of visualization. That's kind of my visual mind seems to be firing, and I'm like can kind of like see these pictures in my mind. So I think that, and I think that's kind of the nature of being a very visual person. That part of my mind kind of tends to be activated in those spaces.
Right.
Do you have that in meditation, that it sort of goes like to a non-verbal, from not a verbal place into kind of a visual place?
Well, the focus of my meditation is always to not think. So I'm always turning off the pictures and turning off the sound, internal
The
sound,
pictures too,
and
yeah.
yeah, everything, and just um, returning to the place I go to in deep dreamless sleep, but doing it consciously.
Mm-hmm.
And then out of that, things do come up, but that's not the focus of it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
And as they come up, I'll just keep turning them off and turn them off, keep coming back to that place. But,
yeah,
as you say, there's so many different types of meditation. It's just the way I meditate.
yeah.
So with the book, um, it feels like you're taking the person on a journey as you go through the different projects. Where where do they arrive at the end of that journey?
Mm. Um, yes, and I did kind of structure the book a bit that way. At the end of the journey, I focus on um, tools for the light worker. And do you know that word? Be a light worker? It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of around in like, new age language. And of course, for me, it's just a beautiful word. And as a painter, as somebody who like I literally think about the direction of the light and creating the light shape and
Yeah.
the shadow shape. And so I almost like in a literal way, like yes, I'm a light worker, like in terms of making light and form. But a light worker, in a broader sense, is someone who just seeks to make the world a little bit better than they found it, or just seeks to interact with the world, um, building either internally, personally, or in your family, in your community, um, building towards something. And or think about like Eleanor Roosevelt, a light worker, is somebody who would rather light a candle than curse the darkness. And
Yeah.
I think that artists are frankly naturally drawn to be light workers, and I think that the world needs light workers. And I think that I hope that I would inspire someone to kind of take that call to really use your creative work to try to make the world a little bit more beautiful, a little bit more peaceful, a little bit more connected. Um, but I think that there's two things that you must have a constant renewable resource of, and that's self-love and gratitude. And those are like essential tools for a light worker. Self-love, honestly, for artists often just means boundaries around your creative time and space, right? Self-love is often just loving yourself enough to know that you just need to sit quietly for 3 or 4 hours and maybe just noodle around with this little thing, because that's what you need to do your creative work. um, Self-love also is about accepting who you are in terms of what your interests are, your motivations are, what you happen to be making in a world full of Instagram and likes and comparison, right? I think of Instagram as the great comparinator, right? It's this horrible machine that helps us like compare everything we're trying to do to all of the fantastic things that other people are doing in it. And how do you, in the face of that, sort of nurture self-love about, no, but I am the person I am. And that takes practice and it takes maturity. And then gratitude. And gratitude is available to us every day if we look for it, whether it's just how good I love my cup of coffee in the morning, nature is full of opportunities for gratitude of just a beautiful sky or a beautiful leaf or a beautiful tree. Gratitude for the relationships we have. Artists, and this was part of my own kind of like something I had to work through. There's all this language about being an artist. Oh, it's a struggle. Oh, you're not going to have a lot of financial free security. Oh, it's very difficult, right? And there's kind of almost an addiction to the anxiety of all of that. And you almost let those ideas define your attitude towards your work. And instead, I think that we have to be constantly very mindful of our privilege and the blessing that we have of being able to do our practice, even if it's just 20 or 30 minutes a day. Even if it's just 20 or 30 minutes of sitting quietly and using your watercolors and drawing. It's a blessing to be able to engage with art practice. And I think when we're able to kind of stay in those states, the state of self-love and the state of gratitude, it really helps like manage all of the other things, the self-doubt, the fear, the anxiety.
Brilliant. Okay, well done on getting it finished. I know probably better than most how difficult it is to finish a book, so well done. And it looks lovely, and I really love the place that you're coming from with it and the journey that you're taking people on with it. So it's called The Path of Drawing, Lessons for Everyday Creativity and Mindfulness. Again, it's available on Amazon, hardback, Patricia Watwood. So yeah, well done. And great.
Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about it. I'm also very grateful to the artists who shared their work and thoughts in creating this. There's a lot of really beautiful artwork by wonderful artists that I also think I put in there really to just inspire people to stay engaged with their creative practice. There's a lot of quotes. So the idea is also that you can just kind of flip open the book for a few pages and then hopefully just be inspired to set it down and go back and go draw.
Brilliant. Wonderful.
Yeah. Thanks for your time, John. I'm glad to see you.
You're welcome. It's lovely to see you again.
I've never felt this good in my entire life. Make me some spaghetti.
Actually, I'd prefer a cup of tea. A cup of tea would be lovely. So yeah, just a little reminder, mainly because every second or third person who becomes a patron has got in touch with me and said, you know what, I've been listening to your podcast for ages and I didn't become a patron, not because I don't have the money, not because I don't think it's great, I just didn't get around to it. So this is a little friendly reminder that if you'd like to be a patron, you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, go to patreon.com/John Dalton, gently does it, all one word, or follow the link in the show notes to become a patron. I would really appreciate it if you could do that, particularly if you've been meaning to and you just haven't got around to it. It would be great. It would mean a lot to me. All right, thank you. Bye.
We are the Argyle Pimps, so buy us a drink. We're better than you thought, but not as good as we think. We are the Argyle Pimps, so buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. We are the Argyle Pimps, so buy us a drink. We're better than you thought, but not as good as we think. We are the Argyle Pimps, so buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. Come on.